Greetings, this is Tony Arend, and this is SFS Online and On Topic. This webinar series brings in distinguished members of the Georgetown faculty and distinguished alums to talk about the most critical issues of our day. It is produced by the Georgetown University Alumni Association in collaboration with the Walsh School of Foreign Service. Now, when Father Walsh was creating the School of Foreign Service in 1919, he could envision many things, but one thing he could not envision was cyberspace and the cyber world. Yet it is part of our reality today, and we are still grappling with it. It is a real honor to have one of the world's leading experts on cyberspace and cybersecurity with us today, Sam Visner. And Sam is not just a leading expert, but he is an alumnus of Georgetown University. He graduated in 1976 from the School of Foreign Service, and I found out moments ago that we both lived in the same dorm freshman year, Loyola Hall on 35th Street. Sam is currently a tech fellow with the MITRE Corporation, and he is also a practitioner faculty in our Science, Technology, and International Affairs program, where he teaches on cybersecurity policy, operations, and technology. Sam has had a distinguished career in both the private sector and the public sector. Recently, he was director of the National Cybersecurity Federally Funded Research and Development Center at MITRE. He worked for the Central Intelligence Agency and the National Security Agency. In fact, when he was at the National Security Agency, he was chief of the Signals Intelligence Program, and he won the highest award given by that agency to a civilian employee. So I can think of nobody better to talk about the evolution of cyberspace, where we are today, than Sam Visner. So Sam, over to you.
Thank you. Dr. Arend, thank you. That was an extremely generous and fulsome introduction. Evidence once again that I have an excellent publicist. It is also important in Washington, however, never to believe all of your own propaganda. You can get into a lot of trouble that way. Anyway, I'm delighted to be here today. I'm both an adjunct at Georgetown as well as an alum. And what Dr. Arend didn't know is that my late brother, Mark Visner, was chief of cardiovascular surgical research at the Georgetown Medical Center. So my links to and roots in Georgetown are exceptionally deep. And assuming I can use PowerPoint correctly, I need you to all understand that since I do live in Washington, D.C., and I am inside the Beltway, I am required by law to use PowerPoint, and therefore I will inflict PowerPoint on the audience. I want to be clear that I'm speaking today as a friend of Georgetown University. I'm not speaking as an employee of MITRE. I'm not speaking in any professional capacity other than in my capacity as a friend of the university as an alum. I have a pretty unusual journey, and my view of cybersecurity today is formed by that journey. I started my professional life as an intelligence officer. I then went into business and worked for years at Booz Allen in a company called SAIC, and then went back to the government around 9/11 to be chief of signals intelligence programs at NSA. At the same time, I also was an adjunct, and then I went back to the private sector and ran some cybersecurity businesses until in 2017, I was recruited to be the director of the federally funded Research and Development Center for Cyber. And having finished that tour, I'm now one of MITRE's tech fellows, which means I'm supposed to be a thought leader, and I'm working right now on 6G, the intersection of 5G, artificial intelligence, and cybersecurity. I'm not an engineer. I don't even play one on television. I took my undergraduate degree at Georgetown in international politics, and I have a graduate degree from George Washington University across town in telecommunications. So I have an unusual background, and my point of view is shaped by it. What I want to talk about today in the few minutes we have is try to tell a bunch of stories at once. There is a whole global IT ecosystem, and it's changing. It's changed in my lifetime. In my lifetime, people were still using Morse code, and today they're using smartphones on 5G networks. So I'm going to try and tell the story of the history of information technology, the history of cyberspace, the history of changes in the concept of cybersecurity, a word we hear, but most of us, I think, don't understand as clearly as we might, and what that means in terms of the sovereignty of nations and how nations are going to attempt to govern this new realm of cyberspace using the tools of cybersecurity. And we're going to do this all in a few minutes. So if at the end you have questions, believe me, I won't be surprised. So how did we get here? We started from a concept of cybersecurity that's very traditional, and I'm going to talk about that in a minute. And we've transitioned to a new concept of cybersecurity, which is controlling cyberspace. So from protecting information, which is traditional cybersecurity, to getting to control of this new realm, cyberspace, and governing it. How we got there is the story I want to tell. So where do we think of as, what do we call cybersecurity? Where did cyberspace come from? Well, in the United States, we think of cybersecurity as a discipline that's practiced in a place called cyberspace. But cyberspace really wasn't a place where people lived. It was a place where computer networks lived. If you live in Washington, there are three terms that we generally consider to be as cybersecurity: computer network defense, computer network exploitation, and computer network attack. Don't focus on defense, exploitation, and attack for a moment. Bear with me and focus on the concept of computer network. What is a computer network? And the concept of a computer network is vital. It's key to understanding today's concept of cyberspace. In fact, if you don't understand computer network, it's hard to talk about cyberspace and cybersecurity. So let's talk about what we mean by a computer network. We started at the end of the Second World War, which is a time in the living memory of some people, maybe even on this call, with point-to-point communications devices, and moved in 40, 50, and then 60 years way past that to things that were interconnected, things that could process and store and process information, things that could handle transactions. We built databases. We learned how to put these things in the cloud, things like Amazon Web Services, and Google Cloud, and Microsoft Azure. We learned how to embed computer code in devices that could be hooked to pipelines and rail switches and heart monitors. We decided to call these things the Internet of Things. We took these cloud architectures and made them global. We decided to collect data and use that and apply artificial intelligence to that data to decide when this light should be green, when this light should be red, when this water flow should be increased or decreased. We decided to give everything we wanted an address on the internet. We call that IP version 6. That gives us the same number of internet addresses as there are stars in the observable universe, and hook it all together with a new kind of internet called 5G. And essentially, we did this within the span of a human lifetime. That's an extraordinary progression. And in that progression, we built a thing called the computer network, which is the thing that inhabits cyberspace as we have known it until now. How did we build this cyberspace? Well, a few things made it possible. The idea of technology, the idea of being able to take the physical universe, sight and sound and quantities, and to represent them in a binary digital code. And we made this technology cheap. Think about all the technology that you carry around on your iPhone or your Android or whatever device you're carrying, and how many hundreds of millions of dollars that used to cost. And you can buy that device for a couple of $100. We put it everywhere. It's ubiquitous. We made this stuff interoperable so that your phone can interoperate with the internet, your printer can interoperate with your computer can interoperate with your Zoom or Skype or Teams call. We also did something that was extraordinary. We combined information and motion, which is transactional information, my voice or a telegraph or data moving back and forth with referential information, like the information in your bank account, information at rest. One other big thing that we did, by the way, is we changed the regulatory structure. Prior to the 1980s, information technology in this country and others was in the hands of monopolies. And these monopolies said people don't need high-speed communication. We don't need fiber optics because there isn't enough information being moved around that requires light waves. And the divestiture of AT&T, what was called the modification of final judgment in the 1980s, here in Washington by Judge Harold Green, essentially opened up the communications and information technology market to competition and led to a market in which demand for new services was met competitively. That was a regulatory change in which the law finally started to catch up with the technology. But the systems that we were building at that time, the information systems that we were building at that time were not, at first, they weren't digital, they weren't cheap, they weren't ubiquitous. And most of the information systems that we had were not possible of processing information at rest. You might make a phone call. You might, if you were at a ship at sea, actually say, this is where another ship is based on my radar, but you had no way of referencing that electronically. Somebody wrote that down on a board with a grease pencil. There was no way to do that. That took the creation of an information revolution, of the creation of what we called a computer network. In other words, cyberspace, in which information in motion and information at rest didn't exist until we built these computer networks. When did we start to build them? Well, the date of the one that I think of as really the first big one is in the 1950s. And starting in 1957, we built a thing called SAGE, or the semi-automatic ground environment, which doesn't sound like anything. But it was actually an automated computer system that took information about where planes and missiles were flying and overlaid that information on digital maps that showed airfields and cities and buildings and other facilities, and used that information to defend North America from Soviet air threats. It was very important that it be secure. We didn't want anybody to steal that data or disrupt that system. But what was important is, for the first time, information that was moving around was related to information that was referential. This is sort of how it looked. And I'm sorry I don't have an animation for this, but use your mind's eye to think about things moving on this map. And if you use Waze, if you use Google Maps, if you use any navigator, think about how this looks. This is a precursor. All right, it's black and white, right? It's not color, it's monochrome. It's kind of low resolution, but nonetheless, think about things moving. Think about transactional data, the track of an airplane or a missile moving over a grid of digitized information showing facilities. And this is what the operators saw. They had screens that looked like big TV screens, and they had a mouse. It was actually a light pen that they could move over this screen, and as they moved this over the screen, things would light up. This is an Air Force base. This is what's at that Air Force base. This is a missile. This is a missile that's tracking in the direction of that Air Force base. Sort of like an air defense version of Google Maps or Waze. This was designed in the 1950s, and this was a network in which information in motion and information at rest were actually unified. Once we did this, we started to learn how to do other things. What was called the Advanced Research Projects Agency built a network in which things were interoperable, and they had an interoperable protocol that made all of this data work together and the devices work together. They connected, that protocol is called TCP/IP, or Telecommunications Protocol, Internet Protocol. By 1969, 4 nodes were connected. I think there are more than that in my house, just in 2 bedrooms here. We connected Europe by 1973, and it was a common architecture of things that work together, of a network of computer networks, a network of systems that unified information at rest and information in motion. This was the progenitor of the internet as we know it today. And that architecture started to emerge in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Vint Cerf put it best as ARPANET transitioned to the internet. He said, "It was the first, and being first was best, but now we lay it down to ever rest." Now pause with me a moment, shed some tears. For old lang syne, for love, for years and years of faithful service, duty done, I weep. Lay down thy packet now, O friend, and sleep. And thus did we put to bed ARPANET and created the internet that we know it today. It's not just a place where information is transmitted. It's now a place that processes that information. It's not just about connectivity, it's about processing information. So we made the transition from communication at the end of the Second World War to integrated computer networks that are today's global cyberspace environment. Now, there are people who are going to ask, how big is cyberspace? And is cyberspace now a place that, in addition to computer networks, has people? And this is where the story turns. This is where things get very, very different. Lenin is reported to have said, "Quantity has a quality all its own." Think about saying that in a Russian accent. We used electromagnetic energy for a long time. We've used light. Hell, in the 18th century in France, they had semaphores, things that looked like windmills that would dot the landscape. And if the windmill was up in this direction, that meant one word. And if it showed in a different direction, it meant something else. And by relaying that from site to site, moving these semaphores across the landscape, simple messages for the crown were transferred. And in the 1850s, we started to use electricity for the telegraph, but only a few people really were using it. So the question is cyberspace different today than it was? Think of only a few tens or hundreds, or even by the end of the 19th century, a few thousand people having this kind of connectivity. Today, there are over 7.6 billion people on this earth. There are a few tens of millions of people who probably set sail. We had in 2017, I don't have later data, about 1 billion people flew, but not at the same time. We have a few people in space at any moment. Maybe Jeff Bezos or Elon Musk will get more up there. We have no trouble thinking about the earth, the sea, the air as domains, and increasingly space. But a lot of people have asked, if a human being isn't physically in cyberspace, is it a domain? Well, the answer is, I think it's certainly a domain. As of the end of 2017, middle of 2017, we had almost 4 billion people online out of the then just over 7.5 billion people in the world. And notice that China has more people online than we have people. We have about 327, now 328 million people in the United States. They have now over 1 billion people online. India has about 500 million people online. So for those countries, cyberspace is not electromagnetic. It's a place where people live. A year later, this gives you a sense of how the data looked. And you get a very strong sense of the fact that in a world in which more than half the people are connected online, it's easy to say now why some countries see cyberspace as not a place of computer networks, but a place of people. This gives you another sense of it. China passed in about 2009 the number of people online that we have people in the United States. Gives you a sense of how China views cyberspace. So what's happening now? IP version 4, which is how we've placed things on the internet, had just over 4 billion addresses. We're running out. IP version 6, which gives us 3.4 times 10 to the 38th, means that we have a virtually unlimited number of things that we can connect to the internet. So if we've got over 4 billion people, believe me, we're going to have billions and billions more, perhaps hundreds of billions of things connected to the internet. And just about everything will be. We're talking about a density of Internet of Things devices that could be as high as maybe 1 million per square kilometer, or perhaps even more. They're going to be hooked to a new kind of network called 5G, of which many of you have heard. And instead of things being hooked up to a local network, all of these IoT devices can be hooked directly to your carrier. And we're starting to see lots and lots of 5G. As you drive around the Washington area with a phone that can do 5G, you'll see it light up. Now, there have been some recent developments that are important, and I want to talk about them. The first is the concept of the Advanced Persistent Threat, or an APT. This is a term you may have heard of, but I want to talk a little bit about it. It's not just that the technology is sophisticated, it's how that technology is used, how an adversary will gain information about a target network and be patient in their prosecution against that network. We call that tradecraft. And the combination of that technology and that tradecraft tends to be wielded principally by nation state actors, which is the case of SolarWinds, and also by cyber criminals. We're also seeing the evolution of national cyber strategy. The White House has published a national cybersecurity strategy, and DoD has had one for several years. Congress has chartered the Solarium Commission, which has made a number of recommendations relating to strengthening the role of the Department of Homeland Security, ranging to ways about effective cyber deterrence. The President's National Security Telecommunications Advisory Committee, or NSTAC, has called for a cyber moonshot to change fundamentally the nation's capacity for cybersecurity. And even the business executives for national security have issued a report on improving the cybersecurity and resilience of our national infrastructure. We are also now beginning to see what may be legislation, possibly to improve the nation's cyber workforce. There is legislation that increases the authority and resources of the Department of Homeland Security. And for those of you who are reading the Washington Post or other national papers, you'll know that Mr. Chris Inglis has been nominated as the National Cyber Director. We are also decided that as a nation, we will begin to move onto our adversaries' networks to detect and to interfere with, to preempt their efforts to both attack and to exploit our information. And this means that cybersecurity, the practice of cybersecurity, is now a tool that near-peer adversaries are wielding in great power competition. We're seeing a new kind of IT infrastructure begin to emerge, and this is an infrastructure in which we take 5G backbones, we combine them with billions of IoT devices. We take that data and we use artificial intelligence to decide when this when this train should move, when this bus should move, where police should be deployed. This, on the other hand, means that these networks are more complex and they change, they're more dynamic. And since they're bigger, they have more attack surface, more places where they can be attacked. It also means that how we manage these systems is going to change, because in a smart city where transportation, energy, and other resources are combined, we need new models to figure out who's responsible for their cybersecurity. And lastly, and I'm a member of the board of directors of the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center, we're looking at whether or not space systems should be considered critical infrastructure. We used the terms earlier in this session: computer network exploitation, computer network attack, and computer network defense, because that's the way we thought about cybersecurity. We defended information inside of computer networks, or offensively, we stole that information. That was called computer network exploitation, or we damaged that information, or we damaged the information systems that use that information, or in a case like Stuxnet, we damaged physical systems that were controlled by computer systems that relied on information. In that case, allegedly making Iran centrifuges run at the wrong speed and burn out. But today, since information is sometimes stolen and then weaponized, we tend to think about not just stealing or defending information, but using it to create influence. And instead of just stealing a few facts, will they attack at dawn or not, and with how many soldiers, we might steal 400 million records, or all the records in the database of the US Office of Personnel Management. And what can we do with that data? Can we use it biometrically to craft some kind of a of a biological attack to be used in warfare or change the outcome of a nation's economic strategy. And then countries like China, or China, is taking this new kind of cyberspace and using integrated computer networks to build a persistent surveillance state to observe what people do in cyberspace and to use cyberspace to observe what they do in physical space. What does this mean? Whereas we thought about cyberspace as electromagnetic, as a place where information was processed and information moved, other countries don't see it that way. We in the United States and liberal democracies, Japan, South Korea, Europe, we operate in cyberspace, we defend in cyberspace, we move information in cyberspace, we even fight there. But we don't think of it as governable. We think of it like the law of the sea. We try to control our assets in this physical space, but we don't try to govern what goes on there. And beyond our own borders, we think of cyberspace the way we think of the law of the sea, as a place of universal jurisdiction. China, Russia, and other countries don't see cyberspace that way. Whereas we see cyberspace as this open electromagnetic environment with information, they see cyberspace as territory, and as territory that is sovereign, in which their government has sovereign prerogatives. So while we see cybersecurity as defending information, they see it as about governing human behavior and defending the legitimacy of their state and their sovereign prerogatives. This has interesting implications. If cyberspace is sovereign territory, maybe a state can get more of it. If cyberspace is sovereign territory, how is it governed? How is it controlled? And by the way, if another country moves into your cyberspace and you think it's sovereign, have they committed an act of war? Russia was apparently successful in getting into our election system in 2016. You can ask yourself and debate certainly with your friends and neighbors whether or not they were successful in influencing that outcome. But if they saw cyberspace as our sovereign territory, even if we didn't, did they see this essentially as a military campaign, even if we didn't? And if so, what did they gain? What did we lose? An interesting set of questions indeed. Do other countries really think this way? I think they do. In 2009, China, Russia, and several other countries signed the Shanghai Cooperation Accord, and they defined cybersecurity as very different from the way we do. They talked about it as the protection of the distribution of information harmful to political and social and economic systems. They didn't talk about protecting information. They talked about protecting the system from information harmful to their sovereign system. That's a very different way of looking at things. And this concept of cyber territory and cyber sovereignty is in fact a theme that you're seeing in more and more academic papers, particularly as countries like China think about, quote, a global south that favors a state-centric model of internet governance, and one that favors the authority of a nation state over its net citizen. There's another way of thinking about this. Joe Nye, who was the chairman of the National Intelligence Council, says we've got to stop thinking about cyberspace as just this technological domain. And he said you've got to think about it as a three-level chessboard, or for those of you who remember the old Star Trek with Spock and his three-level chess. And he said there's a first level that is entirely technological, and that's where IT gives countries that have strong military technology an advantage. We're not unchallenged there, but we're still the most powerful because we have the most powerful information technology. At the mid-level, however, IT is more available. It's not just specialized, and it's used not just for technological purposes, but it's used to empower a multipolar world of commerce. And the barriers to the entry for this kind of technology are not very high. You can buy this technology. But lastly, there's a new level. There's a level at which people are influenced, where people live. And this is a place where political parties, constituencies, religious organizations, social groups, ideological groups, social networks, extremists live and can be influenced. Here, everybody has access to the technology. It's relatively cheap. And he says, this is not a place where you have influence because your technology is the best. This is a place where you have influence because you have, quote, the best story. And that is, in essence, meaning that you know how to craft information and manipulate networks for the proliferation of the story that you want. So I'm not going to try to go through some of this because I want to open this up for some Q&A. So it's time, I think, for us to redefine the concept of cybersecurity. We tried to think of cybersecurity as the protection of information, or on the offensive side, stealing it or damaging it. Stealing it from an adversary, which is something that the National Security Agency does, or damaging it so that they can't run their centrifuges. But today, in a world in which it's not just about the information, it's about how people behave in cyberspace, the new term is maybe to be used is computer network control, achieving the outcomes we desire in cyberspace as a component of national power, where cyberspace is not just an electromagnetic domain, but for some countries, it's a sovereign domain, and it is now absolutely a part of the international system. So I just want to finish up with a kind of interesting vision here, and hopefully we'll have a little bit of time for Q&A. We've thought about cyberspace as an electromagnetic domain. China and others don't see it that way. They see it as a domain of human behavior. We secure information, they secure the behavior of people, just as they do on the streets of their city. So as China moves forward, they look at cyberspace and cybersecurity from a sovereign ideology perspective. They're building out a global investment scheme called One Belt, One Road, and they're spreading information technology along One Belt, One Road in something they call the Digital Silk Road. And on that Digital Silk Road, they have the potential to deploy their own version of 5G, their own version of artificial intelligence, their own version of persistent surveillance. If they own that digital infrastructure, is China wresting sovereignty from those countries? What would happen if that model was extended to our own doorstep? What does that model look like? So first, this is from The Economist. This is where One Belt, One Road is being built, all the way into Europe. What does an infrastructure on that One Belt, One Road, what is it likely to look like? Alibaba, which is a Chinese national champion company, is building an infrastructure called CityBrain. This is sort of an eye chart, but let me take you through the top layer. On the left are all the devices that collect information. In the middle are all the applications that learn from that information, that develop patterns, what we call machine learning, and that make sense of that information to guide the infrastructures on the right. Medical resources, road resources, power resources, administrative resources, and yes, policing resources. In such an infrastructure, is information technology being used just to manage the infrastructure, or does this become the means of governance itself? And consider the level of data that's required to be able to empower such an infrastructure. This is a very interesting view. So we used to be connected in cyberspace. And then as more and more of us were connected and we did more things in cyberspace, we depended on it. But now, more and more of our infrastructures, more and more of our finance, more and more of our electrical grid, our transportation grid, we don't just depend on cyberspace, increasingly we reside in it. And given that we reside in it, the control of cyberspace has become an aspect of great power competition. Great powers are using cybersecurity to influence and to undermine competitors and adversaries, and some great powers with a different ideology are using cyberspace as a domain of human governance, and the tools they use are their redefined concept of cybersecurity. So as we summarize, we've seen this as a domain driven by technology and inhabited by integrated computer networks. But if you take a look at this picture, we evolved from 1945 to 2021, the technology. But to take you back to this one picture, China's experience of cyberspace was less technological and more influenced not by the development of technology, but by the number of people who move swiftly into this cyberspace. For them, naturally, cyberspace became a domain in which humans are governed, and cybersecurity the tools by which they're governed. And that is really where we have come. So for them, cyberspace is about the governance of cybersecurity is about the governance of human behavior. Let me stop at this point because this is rather a lot, and I've tried to leave a little bit of time for Q&A. I'm going to stop sharing these slides and open this back up to the audience. And Tony, I'm going to ask you to be the moderator. Thank you.
Sam, thank you. And that was a tour de force. There was just so much that was covered. And as much as I've worked in this realm sort of tangentially, I learned a tremendous amount from the overview, especially the historical work that you were doing. I would encourage people, we have a few minutes left for questions. If you go ahead and put your questions in the chat and in your control box here, and then I will relay them to Sam. One question Todd Tiemann asks relates to the U.S. government's focus in this area, and he suggests that the U.S. has been more focused on offensive operations in the cyber realm as opposed to defensive operations. And I don't know whether, would you share that thought, or how would you see the United States government conceiving of the cyber realm? You mentioned very much information and protection of information as opposed to governing of individuals, which I think is an important distinction. But would you see it as sort of defensive, offensive, or any comments you might have on that?
Sure. Thank you, Tony. And I want to thank Tom Temin, my friend Tom Temin, for that question. And I want to thank Tom also for asking such a softball question as well. I really appreciate it. There is no question that there is an ongoing and very vigorous debate right now taking place in Washington and elsewhere about the balance between offensive cyber operations and defensive cyber operations. And I'm going to break offensive down into two things. One is what you do essentially to steal or damage somebody else's information. But I think the other aspect of it is essentially offensive defense, which is defend forward, getting into an adversary's network and preempting their ability to conduct an operation against you. And if you read the report of the Solarium Commission, there is a lot of talk about hunt forward and defend forward. But at the same time, with all that talk, a lot of work is being done to improve cybersecurity defenses, particularly in the wake of the SolarWinds affair, in which instead of somebody penetrating a network with malware, they said if we can get the update to software, and we all occasionally update the software on our computers, if that update is infected through the supply chain, we can actually infect people's networks and get the information we want. So it shows us that even if you are trying to disrupt somebody's attempt to steal your information, you can't just get onto their networks and do so. You have to realize that they're working assiduously into our supply chain as well. So that means that we need, even as we continue to give the attention we should to offensive cyber operations, I think you're going to see more discussion in the United States about defensive cyber operations, particularly in terms of hardening the supply chain. I've been working with the Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center with the literal explosion, hopefully not a literal explosion, but a figurative explosion in the number of satellites that are being put up. Starlink thinking of as many as 12,000 and eventually possibly 40,000 satellites for a global 5G network. Blue Origin also building out a global network. And these swarms of smaller satellites doing resource mapping and observation and other things that need to be done. This is a far more complex supply chain than a supply chain in which you had maybe a dozen or a few dozen satellites flying. Now with thousands of satellites flying with parts that are essentially commodity parts from commodity suppliers and maybe even commodity software, what we need to do is to be thinking about more creative ways to defend ourselves, not just by defending the network, but by defending the things that constitute the supply chain that goes into these networks. And remember, a network isn't just computers. It's small computers attached to everything from rocket motors to the valves in pipelines to the device to infusion pumps that infuse medications into people in a hospital room or in an operating theater. So I would say that you're going to see, even as there is increased discussion about hunt forward and defend forward, and the best defense is a good offense, I also think you're going to see increasing focus and maybe more resources. One thing you're going to on defensive cybersecurity, and you will see that more money is being given and more authority, it appears, is being given to the Department of Homeland Security in particular, whose job it is to defend, to help defend the government, to work with the community, with our critical infrastructure, and also to work with the nation's business infrastructure. So you're going to certainly see more resources there. And one last point: the 2021 National Defense Authorization Act calls for a re-examination of what sectors in the United States are considered critical infrastructure and who has principal responsibility for coordinating the defense of those sectors. So it calls for a rewrite of or a review of Presidential Policy Directive 21 that defines which sectors are considered to be critical infrastructure, and that report is due back to Congress in the next few months, which is another reason why I think defensive cybersecurity is going to get more emphasis.
Great. Some other questions here. Kathy Greer asks a question about Silicon Valley companies and their seeming unwillingness at times to collaborate with the U.S. government on a variety of issues in this area. Any comments you would have on that, and perhaps the ability of the government to work more closely with some of those private sector companies?
Sure. So that's a big question. There are a lot of companies and there are a lot of issues. By and large, I would say on most issues, most of those companies are pretty collaborative. If there are technical recommendations the US government has, I think they listen to them. If they learn something about the cybersecurity problems that they think are going to be faced, they tend to share them. And you see a lot of information sharing through the various information sharing analysis centers and information sharing and advisory organizations, or ISAOs. At the same time, Tony, there are also issues that will come up. The biggest issue had to do a few years ago with whether or not Apple would provide the cryptographic keys to an iPhone that was being used by two people who allegedly and apparently were involved in a mass shooting attempt out in California. This was a very difficult issue because on the one hand, I think people at Apple legitimately wanted to help US law enforcement get into those phones and investigate that crime. On the other hand, they didn't necessarily want to expose what could become a vulnerability. In the end, that issue was proved moot because other technical experts, in this case, I think Israeli, and the Israelis are very active here, managed to get into that phone in any case. Mostly, though not always, but mostly I would say the nation's tech industry has been pretty supportive of good cybersecurity. And companies like Microsoft, companies like Google spend a lot of money and have some leading experts in cybersecurity. Microsoft has been very, very fulsome about sharing information when they learn it and using their research to improve the cybersecurity of their operating system and sharing that with the government and with users. So it's not perfect. It will never be perfect. There will always be exceptions, and issues will come up in which companies have to weigh their equities. But fundamentally, I think that situation's, getting better over time.
Great. Let me ask a final question, and this relates to what to read. So Mike Nelson, who was one of our colleagues here, who's now at Carnegie, asks the question, there's a lot of books that have come out about cyber issues the past several months. Is there anything in particular that you would recommend that someone read if they really want to deep dive in this area?
Yeah. I don't have the name of the book in front of me, but Richard Clark has an excellent book about this that I think is very much worth reading. And anything published by Robert Kanacki, who used to be at the White House and is now, I think, at the Center of Foreign Relations, Knake. Those are two good authors who work very hard to demystify this, to demystify the field of cybersecurity. I published a couple of papers through the Georgetown Journal of International Affairs, but in terms of looking at the field from a survey perspective, both Robert Knake and Richard Clark, I think, are among the authors to whom I would turn for a good start.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Sam, and thank everybody for attending. We truly appreciate your insights on this, and we could go on forever because this is a topic which continues to evolve exponentially as we look at the technology in the world. So, Sam, thank you very much. I want to thank everybody for joining us. I want to thank Kelly Young of the Georgetown University Alumni Association for the logistics and making all this happen. And a special shout out to Eleanor Monty Jones. SFS Online and On Topic was her idea when she was working with us as the Director of Alumni Relations. Wish everybody a great day. We will see you next month for the next SFS Online and On Topic.
Thank you.